What are people learning how to fire automatic weapons doing that for if they're not preparing for an armed race war?
That is what they're preparing for. Their end game is simply pure, unadulterated destruction. It is a death cult.
Are we going to see the day where they're walking into a school or to a mall or to a government building and opening fire on everybody?
If they are, they're not going to tell anyone about it until it happens.
Welcome back to Hardball and to our special report. That was a chilling scene from the MSNBC documentary Breaking Hate, describing just one of over 1,000 hate groups that, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, are now active in the United States. Reporting on that study released last year, the New York Times notes that the number of hate groups has pushed to a record high by a toxic combination of political polarization, anti-immigrant sentiment, and technologies that help spread propaganda online. In fact, recent shootings have shed light on how extremists thrive on the dark web, using fringe online platforms to inspire and recruit like-minded individuals with racist ideology. But it's not just those hiding in the shadows today. People who harbor extremist views can also attain positions of influence. BuzzFeed recently told the story of a now former white nationalist, Katie McHugh, who wrote for several prominent conservative media outlets. The organizations she worked for either turned a blind eye to or were genuinely ignorant of the fact that one of their young stars was leading a double life among hardcore racist activists. I'm joined right now by the author of that piece, Rosie Gray of BuzzFeed News. Michael German of the Brennan Center for Justice is a former undercover FBI agent who infiltrated extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Rabbi Jill Jacobs is also with us. She's executive director of TRUA, an organization of more than 2,000 rabbis standing up for human rights. And Jason Johnson, of course, is our friend here, editor of TheRoot.com. You're all newcomers except for Jason, so this is not exactly a pleasant conversation, but it is a true story. Rosie, tell us about McHugh.
Well, she was a young conservative reporter. She worked for the Daily Caller and then for Breitbart. But at the same time, she was getting involved with sort of so-called alt-right activists in Washington, D.C., and was basically a self-acknowledged white nationalist.
How did she get into that group? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Was she involved with the alt-right dangerous groups or just the right-wing media or conservative media?
It sort of happened at the same time. She had these sort of social connections leading her deeper and deeper into white nationalism at the same time that she was, getting jobs at fairly influential right-wing media outlets. Michael,
tell me about that. You've been infiltrated into those groups, and I wonder, what it's like. What's it like?
I think it's really important to understand that there's a difference between the violent fringe and the ideological side of the movement. So what draws people in a lot of time is just deviance. And for the violent fringe, a lot of time it's people who enjoy being violent, and here's a group that gives them a justification for their violent actions and treats them as a hero. On the ideological side, a lot of times it's just to be provocative, and that becomes kind of like a drug, and people push further and further the limits of what society accepts because they want to draw attention to themselves, and this is clearly a way that you can draw a lot of that attention.
What draws the line between the violent and the nonviolent?
It's different in all cases. I mean, sometimes it's tactical. There was a Ku Klux Klan leader named Louis Beam who wrote a strategy called leaderless resistance that was arguing that in order for the above-ground intellectual side of the movement to survive, it had to separate itself and keep an arm's distance from the violent groups to avoid criminal liability. But sometimes it's actually part of what they believe. I mean, typically the type of people who are writing books and giving speeches put a lot of effort into that, and they believe that's an effective way to spread the message, and that the violence is actually counterproductive to their spreading a positive message about their beliefs.
Well, the recent deadly attacks at synagogues in Pittsburgh and Poway, California, came amid a new reporting from the Anti-Defamation League that anti-Semitic assaults in the U.S. more than doubled in 2018. And among those assaults, the ADL classified only 6 as springing from left-wing or Islamic ideology, while almost 1,800 were classified as right-wing, anti-government, white supremacists or other. Rabbi Jacobs, your sense of this on the victim end of this?
Well, first of all, I think it's helpful to understand what anti-Semitism is. Obviously, anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews. It's nothing new. It goes back, unfortunately, 2,000 years. And it started as an anti-religious prejudice against Jews, based on the idea that Christianity had to replace Judaism, and therefore it had to cast Judaism as something evil. But then, in the late 19th century, it changed into a racially based prejudice, meaning that even if a Jew assimilated, even if a Jew converted to Christianity, they were still considered to be a nefarious influence in society. So basically, anti-Semitism is a giant conspiracy theory. It holds Jews responsible for whatever it is that you don't like in society, sometimes with paradoxical effects, meaning that Jews can be blamed both for Marxism and for capitalism. And so there's
for both what?
For both Marxism and capitalism. Whichever side you're on, you think that the Jews are somehow undermining society from the other direction.
What about the recent eruption, the synagogues? I mean, is there cycles to this, or?
There are absolutely cycles to this, and what we know from history is that whenever there is a moment of insecurity, economic or otherwise, people look around for who to blame, and Jews are the classic scapegoats. So right now we're in a situation in which some people are feeling a sense of insecurity in America. There are many people, of course, who are fantasizing about a vision of a white Christian America and looking around to see who it is who's stopping them from having that vision. And at the same time, we have a president who is riling up fear of immigrants, fear of minorities, and encouraging people who are already inclined to look for a natural enemy. And the classic natural enemy is the Jews. And so that's why we have language like, in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. That's very classic anti-Semitism, the fear that somehow Jews are coming in to undermine American society. Or the Pittsburgh terrorist who suggested that Jews were trying to undermine American society by bringing in refugees. Now, of course, the Jewish community is very supportive of immigrants and refugees, but this person was casting Jews as trying to carry out some kind of plot to change America from his ideal of a white Christian society.
Jason, one thing, and I appreciate learning all this, you know, one of the things I noticed is that people always go after people in mosques, churches, synagogues. They go where people are most religious, most committed to something better than themselves. It's not like they catch them doing something bad.
No.
They go, let's go get them where they're at their best.
Right, right. It's not vigilantism, right? It's not going out and grabbing people who are committing some sort of crime that you can list. It's the kind of violence that also strikes at the heart of the community at large, because it makes you think, oh my gosh, if these good people can be in your sights, then what will you do to me? That's part of the purpose of going after these religious locations. But I think there's something really key here that one of the previous guests mentioned. This idea that there's a big difference between sort of the intellectual right wing and the violence, it's disingenuous. They're connected together. It's the same thing as saying, well, we don't really know.
Well, let's talk to Michael about that. Michael, how do you mean they're this? What's the argument?
Because you can't achieve white nationalism in America without violence. And anyone who says that you can is a liar.
Okay, let me go back to Michael. What's your sort of clinical estimate of that lack of a distinction?
Well, you just have to understand the numbers. I mean, there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who hold racist ideas, and the number of people who are actually committing racist violence is very low, and in fact, a very low proportion of the people committing violence in our society. If you look at attacks that are supposedly inspired by some kind of ideology, they're dwarfed by the number of just spree shooters or other attackers. So I think we have to understand how the groups organize in a way because what you need to do to address the hate being spread through whatever methods is different from what you have to do to reduce the amount of violence in our society. And those are two separate things that require separate responses.
Well, Rosie, back to you. You write about the emergence of the alt-right in 2016, saying the alt-right was all about smoothing over its public image, becoming approachable, more mainstream. The very term alt-right represented this effort to rebrand white nationalism. Who came up with that term, alt-right? Enemy or friend of that group?
The white nationalist leader, Richard Spencer, has taken credit for inventing that term. Yeah, I mean, as I wrote, there was an attempt to basically sort of rebrand white nationalism, make it kind of more respectable seeming, make it more mainstream, and call it the alt-right. And that's something that really picked up steam over the last few years. And that is something that was more on the sort of ideological side of the sort of division that was just being talked about between these groups that carry out kind of actual violence and groups that are sort of providing a sort of ideological underpinning for racist ideas.
What's your reaction to the alt-right, Rabbi?
Well, as Rosie said, there's the larger movement, which is spreading these racist ideas, and then, of course, the smaller number of people who are going to actually take those ideas to the extreme and carry out violence. But the whole movement is terrifying because we have racist, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic ideas that are spreading in our society. And in a society in which guns are plentiful, in which it's not hard to get a gun, it's not surprising that there are some people who take these hateful ideas and take them off the internet and actually walk into our houses of worship and an attack, whether it's about walking into a synagogue in California or in Pittsburgh and shooting, whether it's about an arson at a mosque in Connecticut, or very recently, just this past weekend, an attempted arson at a synagogue in Chicago. There are people who have access to violent means, who are going to move to the natural extension of these hateful ideas and try to carry out violence.
Well, Rosie, Rabbi Jacobs, Jason, and Michael, we're all staying together. Up next, fighting back against the hate. What can we do about it? Does the government need to do more to rein in these groups? How do you balance that with Americans', of course, constitutional rights?